Whose idea was it anyway to go from Pollock Shields to West Africa?
An exchange to Mali for the return of a new food.
Left me down and tea.
And welcome to the debating chamber of the Old Royal High School in Edinburgh for the third cross-examination, the series in which the leaders of Scotland's main political parties face interrogation by specially nominated political opponents. Tonight, the leader of the Scottish National Party, Alex Salmond, takes the stand, and he's going to start proceedings by telling us succinctly why we should vote for his party in these inaugural elections. Mr. Salmond.
Thanks, Annie. I think there are three defining issues of this election. Firstly, the question of real investment in Scotland's public services, which is under great pressure. And only the SNP has said definitely that we'd forgo the penny tax bribe, freeze income tax, and invest the £690 million in the things that really matter: health, education and housing. Secondly, the question of the private finance initiative, a hyper-expensive, inefficient, costly way to fund public services. We've got a better alternative in the public service trusts. And thirdly, we're the only party who will trust the people with the constitutional future of Scotland through an independence referendum. All of the other parties, to a greater or lesser extent, still have their strings pulled from London. This is the first Scottish Parliament for 300 years, the first democratic Parliament in our history. I think the most appropriate result would be Scotland's party to run Scotland's Parliament.
Alex Salmond, thank you. And now it's straight over to our panel of cross-examiners. They are Brian Fitzpatrick for the Labour Party, Brian Monteith for the Conservatives, and Malcolm Bruce for the Liberal Democrats. Malcolm Bruce, perhaps you'd like to start us off.
Alex, at the start of this campaign, you took a controversial stance on Kosovo. Given the reaction that you've had in the polls and indeed on the doorsteps, don't you think that that proves that for many Scots and many people in Scotland, when push comes to shove, there's a very strong common identity with British interests?
Well, I think there's a common identity through the Western world and through humanity in general, Malcolm. But I think the stand I took in Kosovo was the right one. I think I spoke my mind out. I told the truth as I see it. And after 5 weeks of a bombing campaign, I think when the plight of the Kosovo Albanians is now 100 times worse than at the start of the campaign, we can see that the fears and concerns I had have indeed been vindicated. And I'm interested that the NATO powers and the European Union are now contemplating implementing an oil blockade, which is exactly what was suggested by the SNP 4 weeks ago. And I think perhaps you should give us a little bit credit for that.
But that was not instead of, it was as well as a bombardment. I mean, the point...
No, but we suggested instead of, Malcolm, and including the Russians with United Nations sanctions.
Yes, but leaving that aside, you said in your reply to me that there was a common interest across the Western world in this. Why is it, in your view, in Scotland's interests, to be the only significant country if it was independent, not to be a member of the NATO alliance? Well, why is it in Scottish interest to differ itself and distance itself from those countries that are engaged within the NATO alliance for common defence and security?
Malcolm, I don't know if you've got comrade parties in Sweden, Austria and Ireland, but I think it's very unwise of you to say they're not significant countries. I mean, these to me are significant countries within the European context, and they're
Norway,
not within the NATO alliance.
You're very fond of quoting Norway as your example. No, Norway is an enthusiastic member of NATO.
Malcolm, I'm just pointing out, you said every significant country, and I've just mentioned 3 countries which I think are significant, which you shouldn't describe as insignificant.
But you haven't answered my question. Why is it in Scotland's interest not to be part of NATO?
I haven't answered your question because you've interrupted me twice, Malcolm, but I'll give you the answer now. I think that through our policy, which would look at the Western European Union, which look at partnerships for peace, then we have a policy which gives cooperation in a European context, but doesn't put us into the command structure of a military alliance which has the highest concentration of nuclear weaponry in the west coast of Scotland. And that's why I think our policy is right.
Do you think, though, Alex Salmond, that perhaps to get back to the specific issue of Kosovo and the apparent backlash there has been about what you said, that perhaps some Scots might have seen you, although you certainly hold these views in all good faith, but as a party leader you said something that was used in propaganda in Serbia and in the middle of a conflict in which our servicemen are actually risking their lives.
I mean, I think that's basically stuff and nonsense. I mean, I've seen John Simpson described. Well,
Why do you say that?
I've seen John Simpson described in terms of being the voice of Belgrade. I've seen Dennis Healy and Peter Carrington, people who actually fought in the war, being described as appeasers over the last 4 weeks. Now, I haven't impugned anyone's motives in this action. I'm quite certain that the NATO leaders are acting for the highest, the noblest of reasons. But I do think what they did was wrong, and I do believe I've got the right to say in a democracy they're wrong when I believe that to be true.
Isn't there, as a party leader, a time and a place to say that kind of thing?
Well, if you have a ministerial broadcast, and that's what it was, a ministerial reply to the Prime Minister's broadcast, then you've got two choices. You can either say what you believe and make the point, or you can equivocate and not make the point. I think my obligation is to tell the truth as I see it. I put forward an alternative, an oil embargo, which I think would have been a much better economic weapon to use, because I think at the end of the day, economic power is more important in this world than military might, and is a much better way of resolving disputes and restoring the Kosovo Albanians to their homeland in peace and security.
It would also be a lot slower, though, wouldn't it?
Well, Annie, we're 5 weeks into a bombing campaign, and just now that the NATO and European Union have decided on an oil embargo, presumably they've decided on an oil embargo because there's a realization that the bombing campaign has not been effective.
Right.
Do you honestly believe that an oil embargo would have stopped atrocities such as at Ratchak? Do you think that's what would change Milosevic's mind?
Well, Brian, there's no doubt that Milosevic is a gangster. He bears the primary responsibility for the instability in the Balkans over the last 10 years. And there's no doubt that atrocities were taking place in Kosovo. But the plight of the Kosovo Albanians is now 100 times worse, literally, than it was when the bombing campaign started. Because the first thing that happened was the United Nations monitors, the Red Cross monitors, were withdrawn from Kosovo. They were the only protection that these people had. They had to be withdrawn to start the bombing campaign. And we've now got a humanitarian tragedy of biblical proportions.
Does it give you pause that the Kosovo Albanians themselves appear to want this bombing campaign?
Well, the Kosovo Albanians want a ground campaign, Annie, but the NATO leadership have not acceded to that as yet. I mean, if people have been decanted, subjected to what these people have, then it's quite understandable they would want the maximum force possible. But the fact remains that the bombing campaign demonstrably has not improved the condition of the Kosovo Albanians. And can I remind you that the latest polling indications in Scotland indicate that only a minority of people share the view that the bombing campaign has worked.
Right, Brian Fitzpatrick?
Alex, in all of the stuff and nonsense, you don't seem to have found time to commend the bravery or the forbearance of our troops that are in the Balkans.
Brian,
You certainly didn't manage to do it in your own broadcast.
well, that's not true. I did so do it in the broadcast. I mean, I can show you the text if you wish. One of the things I said was I support the forces. And I do support the forces. I'd support the forces in any action they were ordered into. But just because you support the forces does not mean that the politicians who make the decisions can be above and beyond criticism. And I did resent, Brian, some of the campaign that was launched against me to distort what I said. As you know very well, since some of your colleagues were behind that campaign.
Alex, can I move you on in relation to the tactics that you've adopted in this campaign? In particular, I'd like to ask you about the timing of the referendum that you mentioned in your opening remarks. Your deputy leader has said that nobody would want the whole process to drag on. Could this referendum be within a year of you taking power in the event that you win on May the 6th?
You mean if we won an overall majority?
Yes.
Do you expect us to win an overall majority, Brian?
Alex, interesting as that answer would be. You're meant to be answering the question.
The more interesting.
I was only saying if you could answer it.
Well, the more interesting question, Mr.
Brian,
Salmond,
if the SNP won an overall majority, Brian,
Mr. Salmond,
then I would wish to begin negotiations in terms of independence for Scotland. I would expect a negotiation period to last on European examples around 6 months. I'd like to see a referendum held as soon as possible thereafter. We framed our commitment in the manifesto to hold a referendum on independence within a 4-year term of the Parliament. That's precisely framed in order to allow us the flexibility of meeting that manifesto commitment if the eventuality, which I think I've got to prepare for, is that we win the election but are not in possession of an overall majority in a proportional system, something that's happened not once this entire century. So I think it's reasonable for us to prepare for the eventuality of being the leading party but not having an overall majority.
Why would it be justified to have a referendum if the majority of people in Scotland had voted for parties who were not in favour of independence?
Well, the referendum doesn't make the referendum makes the choice. It allows people to make the choice in independence. I mean, you'd be quite right in arguing that position that Malcolm... Well, sorry, you can be quite right in arguing, well, no, I don't think that's true, Malcolm, because what we're saying is we're seeking a mandate to hold a referendum on independence. I've acknowledged, and I've acknowledged for several elections now, that a decision on the Constitution, like a move to Scottish independence, is not decided in a general election campaign, whether it be a British or a Scottish one. That's decided on many issues, many social and economic issues. A decision on a constitutional issue like independence must be decided in a referendum, where you put the straight question to the people, yes or no. Now, my question to you would be, why on earth do you want to deprive people of the right to make that choice?
Just before we move on, Alex, from party tactics, I just wanted to ask you about the response to the unusually bad polls that appeared last week. Most parties usually say in response to that it's a blip or the doorsteps are telling them something different, but you changed your tactics right the way through. Doesn't that seem to give across an image of panic?
Well, Annie, it's a blip and the doorsteps are telling us something different, okay?
But you still changed your tactics.
Well, we stepped up our campaign. We stepped up our campaign because we've had something of a difficulty, which I accept, in communicating some of our ideas through the Scottish Press Corps. So we thought we'd take our campaign above the Scottish Press Corps, direct to the people, step it up over these last 10 days of the campaign and see if we can win the election for Scotland. Now, you can call that what you like. I'd call that good politics.
Okay.
Is it sealing
Very, very briefly.
Alec, this is your chance to be absolutely clear. You're talking about a referendum after negotiations that you said will take up to 6 months. Are you saying that in the event that your party wins control on May the 6th, we'll be having a referendum on independence before Hogmanay?
I said we'd hold the referendum after negotiations as soon as possible.
And the negotiations will take 6 months.
The mistake, if I can put it this way, that the Labour Party have made in this campaign is you're trying to give people the impression that the decision is going to be made in the election. I've made it absolutely explicit for a number of elections that a decision like independence can only be made by the people of Scotland in a referendum.
But how quickly would that happen, Alex Salmond? Very briefly. 6 months?
Well, if we win an overall majority, Annie, it'd be 6 months for negotiations, then a referendum as soon as possible.
Right.
If we are not in a position of an overall majority but emerge as a leading party, then the precise commitment is to hold a referendum within the 4-year term in the Parliament.
Unless it's the Liberal Democrats, in which case they won't
Well,
join with you.
some Liberal Democrats, I mean, Donald Gorrie seemed to indicate that he was quite in favour of that last year. Well, you shake your head, Malcolm, but he did so. I've got it on the record.
Okay, we're going to have to move on because we've been promised an SNP strategy on independence later this week, but the other parties have already made much of the economic consequences of separation. Malcolm Bruce?
Can I ask you, Alex, why you haven't yet published your statement on your view of the economics of independence? It's only a week to go and we haven't heard your case.
Well, in the first week of the campaign, we published our manifesto for the devolved Parliament. And the second week, we published our Penny for Scotland strategy, the heart of the economics, the investment in public service that we want to see for the devolved Parliament. Last week, we published our local government manifesto. These elections are also taking place on the 6th of May. And this week, we're publishing our economic strategy for an independent Scotland. So we've published one major document a week in the course of the campaign. I think that's quite reasonable and a way to put the information before the public.
So does that mean independence is either the top or the bottom of your priorities?
No, it means that we published 4 major documents in the campaign, and each of them have something very important to say to the Scottish people about these elections. But can I point out to you that the commitment to publish that document was in our manifesto, published in the first week of the campaign, so we were hardly hiding it away from people.
All right. Do you accept, without arguing about different independent academic figures and so forth, that there are risks attached to independence? There is the possibility that an independent Scotland might be worse off?
I accept there are huge risks with continuing in the Union.
No, I didn't ask you that. I didn't ask you that.
I think we see
I didn't
risks.
ask you that.
I think we see these risks daily in the jobless count in Scotland,
no downside?
Malcolm. I think there are huge risks in terms of devolution, and I think
I didn't
independence
ask you
is
that.
the best
Do
prospect
you
for
believe there are
Scotland.
risks attached? Is it a no-risk strategy, independence?
I
in your
think
view?
independence is the best strategy for Scotland.
There's no
and if
risks?
if we pursue sensible policies in an independent Scotland, then we can be one of the most prosperous countries in the world, and I think that's a good thing.
I'll say it for Malcolm. Despite all that, you haven't actually answered this question.
Well,
Are you saying there are no risks?
I'm saying that the risks of staying in the Union are much higher than the risks of independence.
So you're accepting there are risks then?
I'm saying the risks of independence are much lower than the risks of staying in the Union,
Lower.
which you support.
Ergo there are risks.
Alec,
That's no way to speak to Brian.
Britain's a net contributor to the European Union, some £1.5 billion. You say Scotland would be within the top 10 of the richest nations in the world. Would you expect us to be a net contributor to the European Union? And if so, how would that be funded?
Well, the countries which are more prosperous than Scotland at the present moment, like Denmark, for example, get a net contribution from the European Union at the present moment. So it doesn't necessarily follow in terms of wealth and contributions. But I'm not looking for Scotland's economic prospects to be based on subsidies from Brussels or anywhere else. I mean, Scotland is a rich country, rich in natural resources, rich in human resources, and we're perfectly able to stand on our own 2 feet and have a successful economy here in Scotland.
But can I ask you, you have complained in your own manifesto that Scotland's economic base, and particularly its export base, is too narrow. If, in fact, one of our major industries went into decline and we had, for no fault of Scotland's, because of world conditions, could we not have a rise in social security charge on the Scottish taxpayer, a possible migration of taxpayers looking for jobs elsewhere, and consequent economic difficulties on a much greater scale for 5 million people than shared throughout the United Kingdom?
Malcolm, some of our major industries are in decline at the present moment. Not just the industries like shipbuilding under huge pressure, but the industries like electronics, where we see another announcement today and 500 jobs in severe jeopardy in Ayrshire.
But there is a UK tax base to try and hold
there's a
up,
UK
as it were,
tax
social
base,
security
and there's
payments
a
of
UK
unemployment.
economic policy which has been severely harmful to Scottish economic interests, and we've got to change that policy and drive the Scottish economy forward.
Brian
Alec,
Fitzpatrick.
in your remarks there, you said that independence was the best strategy for Scotland, and I'd like to flesh that out a bit with you. In your party's 1997 manifesto, you calculated the fiscal surplus for next year at 5.4 billion. Last night, your deputy leader said that the SNP's view remained that there was a surplus. Can I ask you just a simple question? At this time, what do you say is the amount of the surplus in the Scottish public finances?
Well, in Scotland, I saw John Swinney's interview last night, and he said there wasn't a fiscal deficit in Scotland, and that's quite clearly the case relative to the United Kingdom.
Was he saying
there
it
is
was
no
balanced?
fiscal deficit, and that is what we've argued, and we've argued consistently. And when you read our economic strategy document on Friday, Brian, as I'm sure you will, you'll see that spelt out in the most enormous detail.
Yes, but Alec, I mean, you're an economist. Come on, you must know the figures now.
I'm-
You saying...
I'm an economist,
Are you
and you're a
refusing-
lawyer, Brian,
Are you
and
refusing
so
to
let's
say-
talk about economics.
Well, Alec, are you saying that you don't know tonight what the amount is of the surplus that you're calculating that you're going to announce on Friday?
No, I'm not saying that at all, Brian. I'm saying I'm going to announce it on Friday as part of a document charting out an economic strategy for Scotland, and I'm announcing it on Friday. I'm not announcing it tonight.
Is it a secret, Alec?
No, it's going to be in a document on Friday which is going to be published for all to see, including the Labour Party. Can I ask you, Brian, when is the Labour Party going to publish an economic strategy for Scotland?
We're not going to answer that because Labour's tomorrow night. Are you concerned at all about the number of negative academic surveys that have come out about the prospects for an independent Scotland?
On the contrary, I think the burden of academic evidence through this campaign has been extremely positive, and we've had the David Hume report, which is a very, very substantial report from an institute which couldn't possibly have been considered as being favourable to the SNP in terms of its track record. We've had the work of Andrew Hughes-Hallett, who's the Jean Monnet Professor at Strathclyde University, which has looked specifically at the convergence criteria in Scotland and the euro, and says that Scotland, as he puts it, would sail through all 5 convergence criteria. And only yesterday we had Grant Baird, who until last week was the chief executive of Scottish Financial Enterprise, coming out and saying exactly the same thing. I think the academic evidence has been very favourable.
Grant Baird is a SNP supporter, it has to be said. And you are an economist and I am but a journalist, but it does have to be said that most of these surveys, as I understand it, are suggesting that an independent Scotland would prosper in an extremely free market economy, not the kind of public sector economy that you're talking about.
Well, I dispute that most of these surveys are showing that. I'm saying the burden of evidence in this campaign from academic sources has been extremely favourable. You say Grant Baird is a member of the SNP. He actually joined yesterday. But he was also... Well, because he's left as chief executive of Scottish Financial Enterprise and is free now to pursue politics. But he's also, Annie, a former chief economist of the Royal Bank of Scotland, and I suspect he knows what he's talking about in the economy.
Alec, can I just press you? You don't obviously want to talk about the figures, but can I just ask you a very simple question? Do you accept that there is a fiscal surplus, or do you say that there is a fiscal deficit? Can you at least answer that? The question is relative to the United Kingdom, and Scotland is not in fiscal deficit. Brian, over the years from 1979 to 1995, Scotland accumulated a fiscal surplus, an absolute surplus, of over £30,000 million. Donald during the referendum campaign described that as, quote, a fact. Do you think it was a fact, or do you not agree with Donald Dewar? I'm interested in what's happening in 1999.
Brian,
These reports by David Human's CBR, they all said that yes, Scotland had the potential to do very well under independence after some initial costs. But the crucial point they made was that there would have to be a cut in the public sector, and there would have to be a free enterprise economy. Now, you're the party that's talking about increasing the number of nurses, increasing the number of teachers, more spending on housing, and raising the tartan tax. Surely you're not the party that actually would be able to take Scotland that way.
Well, I mean, Brian, what you've done is substitute in your own brand of the Michael Forsyth free market economics. I'm a social democrat.
Same economics as Grant Baird, by the way.
I'm a social democrat. I think there are plenty of countries in Europe which have shown highly successful economic performance pursuing a social democratic model. And the social democratic model is one which encourages business and enterprise, but unlike your brand of politics, also practices the politics of social concern and defends public services.
You don't think those parties, those social democratic parties, indeed even the Labour Party here, learnt anything from free market economics under Mrs Thatcher and John?
Very briefly, Alex Salmond, I think we know what you're going to say.
What I think is if the Tory party couldn't win an election in Scotland pursuing Tory policies, I don't think the Labour Party can win an election in Scotland in Tory policies either.
To be said, though, I mean, for many members of the public, this is all extremely confusing, totally contradictory reports from economists, and economics is a very subjective thing. Don't you have to accept that if there was a real passion for independence, people would be voting for you? It doesn't matter if they're going to be worse off or better off in an independent Scotland. Isn't that what really counts?
No, I mean, I think the economic debate on independence is a very valid and legitimate one. It's what I've pursued for many years.
But that's not what's going to win you independence, is it?
Whether people vote for us or not will be determined a week on Thursday, Annie. But what I would say, yes, I mean, the fundamental case for independence is that Scotland is a nation. Nations have the right of self-determination, and the evidence internationally is that nations which have that right of self-government usually perform better than allowing somebody else to run their affairs. That's the fundamental case for Scottish independence.
But there are risks attached.
Lower than the UK risks of staying in the Union.
Yeah, I think we're going round in circles at this point. We'd better get back to this campaign and the SNP's economic proposals for the devolved Parliament. Brian Fitzpatrick.
Alec, your policy is to reverse the 1p cut in income tax that was part of Labour's budget. Can I ask you, how many Scots on below average earnings would pay 23 pence in the pound rather than a 22 pence basic rate under your proposals?
Well, the Scotsman yesterday told us how many Scots support that tax freeze, and the answer is 80%, Brian. 80% support the tax freeze.
I'll remind you of the question because it was quite a straightforward question. How many Scots on below average earnings would pay 23 pence in the pound rather than a 22 pence
Okay,
basic
when
rate
someone
under your proposals?
on minimum wages, Brian, would pay 4 pence a day, would defer a tax cut, a bribe of 4 pence a day. Somebody on average earnings of £17,000 a year would forgo a tax bribe of 30 pence a day. And somebody on high earnings, like an MP or an advocate, it would be 75 pence a day. Now, I think for all of these groups in society, that's better to put these pennies together and invest £690 million in public services in Scotland.
I'll ask you again, because you've got the opportunity. I take it you did think about how many Scots were affected by your proposals. So I'll ask you again, how many Scots on below average earnings would pay 23 pence in the pound rather than a 22 pence basic rate?
Well, I've given you the figures
Alex, does that mean you don't
as people.
know? Alex,
Brian,
does that mean you don't
I'm going to
know?
give you another answer, and I'll do it in terms of types of categories. I've already told you low earnings, medium earnings and high earnings. I can do it in terms of individual categories of worker. Taxation by income tax is
Alex,
by far the
up?
fairest way to tax people, Brian. It's a lot fairer, for example, than backdoor taxes like petrol tax or tax intensive.
Alex, I'll take it that means that you don't know. Can I help you perhaps with the answer?
Go ahead.
Over 1.3 million Scots on below average earnings.
What are you taking
would
as
pay
average earnings,
higher
Brian?
taxes because of your plan.
Sorry, what are you taking as average?
Male average earnings.
Full-time male average earnings.
Full-time
Why aren't you
male
including
average
female
earnings.
average earnings?
Alex,
Why full-time male average earnings?
It's a straightforward question.
Why full-time male average earnings instead of average earnings, Brian?
Alex, it's a straightforward question. To you, tonight, you're the man that wants to reverse the tax cut. When you decided to reverse that tax cut, did you ever take into your calculations the number of people that were affected? Do you know the answer to that question
just a yes or
tonight?
no,
Well,
Alex.
the answer is yes, we did, and we looked at average earnings across the spectrum. We didn't exclude the female population when we did our calculations, Brian. And unlike the Chancellor, we didn't claim that the average impact was £258 a year for 2 million families, when you know full well that the average impact is less than half of that. Why did the Chancellor do that, Brian, if it wasn't to attempt to scare and intimidate people in Scotland?
You're doing it again. You're asking.
It wasn't that long ago that as a party you were courting the business vote. Yet by introducing this tartan tax, you're actually hitting 280,000 self-employed businessmen. Why have you given up on the business vote?
I haven't given up on the business vote, Brian. I mean, there's a Business for Scotland organisation which supports independence, which has 200 subscribers. It has some of the best known names in the Scottish business community are part of that, including 2 out of the last 3 chief executives of Scottish financial enterprise. My finding is the party which has got scarcely any business support in Scotland at the present moment is the Conservative Party, and that's not surprising because you've got scarcely any support in any section of the community.
Of course. Cheap jibes are your hallmark. The point we're wanting to get at is, do you actually therefore believe in low business taxes? Because you're sending the wrong messages, surely.
Well, in our manifesto, Brian, we propose a substantial cut in business rates for small businesses, which is hugely more important in terms of the economics of running a small business than a penny off the basic rate of income tax. I mean, if the small businessman you're talking about, Brian, was grossing, let's say, full-time male average earnings of £17,000 a year, then the benefit of the penny off income tax is 30 pence a day. That's a bag of crisps. Now, a cut in business rates is more important than a bag of crisps a day.
So you'd rather cut business rates and increase the tax on the lowest paid?
No, the business rates will cost us £50 million a year. It's funded from the Holyrood project. The 690 million raised by the Penny for Scotland is going into health, education and housing, and I'm sure you've read our documents and have seen it itemised where all of that money goes into these vital services.
Alex, Liberal Democrats can agree with you that we are not going to raise the standards of health and education in Scotland without significant extra funding over and above what Labour are now putting in. We've got agreement there. But the fact is that the public finances are improving quite sharply. Gordon Brown is constantly finding money he didn't know he had. We have an autumn statement before the first Scottish Parliament budget. If the government found, as they could, an extra £2.5 billion to put into UK health and education, which would be 250 million or more a year for Scotland, would you still put up the taxes?
Well, unfortunately, it wouldn't be £250 million a year for Scotland, Malcolm, because what you failed to take into account is the impact of the Barnett squeeze. We're in a situation in Scotland where, according to the Comprehensive Spending Review, well, listen, this is quite important, Malcolm. The increase in expenditure.
It's 250 million.
No, sorry, it's not. The increase in expenditure is going to be something like a half to a third of the UK programmes.
No.
Public spending in Scotland is going to be under severe pressure. Malcolm, you're shaking your head.
It's
the one thing that all of these economic reports, from any point of view, have actually agreed on.
Not in cash terms. In percentage terms, yes. Not in cash terms.
Well, if it's in, Malcolm, if it's in percentage terms, then you'll have to explain to me, as a simple economist, how it doesn't translate into money terms as well.
It does. £2.5 billion of UK expenditure translates to £250 million.
Malcolm, has the Chancellor told you he's going to do this?
He will be. The Chancellor delivers a statement in November. The Scottish first budget, when you decide about taxes, will be next spring. If the Chancellor has put an additional investment in health and education, as we believe he should and could, would you still put up taxes?
Well, I think the additional investment of a tax freeze, which is what is talked about, is worth the additional £690 million into vital services in Scotland.
So you'd put more
Malcolm,
in
the difficulty with your position is that, given that we've got an election a week on Thursday, I don't think it's reasonable to say to the people of Scotland, maybe, on this vital issue as far as
leaving aside
taxation
the
is
Liberal
concerned.
Democrat position, Alex, if hypothetically the Chancellor were to get more money for Scotland, you're saying that you would still move, or at least stick with your penny for Scotland policy?
Well, I think the advantage and the opportunity of freezing the basic rate of income tax and having substantial additional resources in health, education and housing is too good an opportunity to miss for these vital services in Scotland.
So you're saying that if you were to introduce the penny for Scotland policy, people would actually be no worse off, that the rest of the budget wouldn't affect them at all?
Well, there's
no balance?
No, we're looking at the basic rate of income tax, Annie. I mean, it's a
but
freeze
there
in
were
the basic...
I should be the first to say there were other taxes, and this supposedly compensates.
I am not in favour of this Dutch auction on the basic rate of income tax, because the process that we're going round in the United Kingdom is for Labour to reduce to 22. No doubt Brian's party will go to 20 at the next election, 19. And Labour will see these, well, 19, we've heard it tonight, and Labour will see their 19 and go to 18. And in the meantime, public services will disintegrate. Now, I think we should fund public services in Scotland, and we should have the guts to say it in this election.
And this is the point in the programme when each of our panel is going to concentrate on one aspect of SNP policy from their manifesto. Brian Monteith, what's your choice?
Yes. You say in your manifesto that the Scottish National Party would abolish tuition fees.
Correct.
If you were not the party in administration, if you were in opposition with a number of other parties, would you join with the Liberal Democrats, possibly, and the Tories to actually vote for the abolition of tuition fees?
Well, in government or in opposition, I'll vote for the abolition of tuition fees in Scotland.
I understand today that Nicola Sturgeon in an interview said that on no account would the SNP join with the Tories in voting down abolition.
No, she didn't. I mean, what Nicola Sturgeon said was under no circumstances would we go into a coalition with the Tories to form an administration, and that most certainly is our policy, Brian, for reasons that I don't really have to go into.
Right, Malcolm Bruce. I'm sorry, Brian, Malcolm Bruce.
You have, in your Penny for Scotland, put forward a proposal of putting between 80 and 90 million pounds a year into health. Some additional doctors and nurses, I'm not quite sure how many. Liberal Democrats, for example, have agreed with you in principle. We'd have 1,000 more nurses, 500 extra doctors to deal with the pressure in the health service. But the question is that we've known this was necessary ever since Labour adopted a policy of implementing Tory spending plans. Why did you only discover this need 10 minutes after Gordon Brown sat down after delivering his budget with a pledge to cut taxes?
Well,
briefly, if you would, Alex.
Malcolm, our pledge is to put an additional £380 million into health, funded from both the Penny for Scotland and the Holyrood project, and an extra £350 million into education. Well, I have the figures here, Malcolm. Well, there's the Penny and there's the Holyrood project. We've said that we're funding it from the Holyrood project and the Penny for Scotland. I've still to find a convincing explanation of where you're going to fund additional expenditure without seeking to freeze the rate of taxation.
We don't need to know Liberal Democrat policy at this point.
The point, quite simply, Alex, is we agree that we need extra funding. But we start by deciding what the funding is, and then where we're going to get the money from. You appear to decide to put up taxes and then decide how to spend it. Is that the right way around?
Malcolm, not put up taxes, freeze taxes, and allocate the money to the things that really matter.
You cannot get away with that.
Sorry.
You are using the tax-varying powers to put up a penny up.
No, freeze taxes are the way they are. But Malcolm,
please.
the rate of income tax is 23 pence just now. Under our proposals, it still will be 23 pence. That seems to me like a tax freeze, not a tax rise.
Alec, your deputy, John Swinney, at the outset of this campaign, said that he could envisage pegging a Scottish currency to sterling, or that Scottish currency being free-floating, or membership of EMU. And I want to ask you about your party's policy on a separate Scottish pound. Would that currency be pegged to sterling, or would it float freely in the markets? Or would you be eligible for membership of EMU?
Well, we would be eligible for membership of the European Monetary System and the Euro. The eligibility criteria, as Hughes Hallett was indicating, would be easily met in terms of Scottish economic performance. My expectation, given the timing of a referendum on this, which is either 3 or 4 years away, is that we would join the Euro on the same day or at the same rate as sterling. That's the best, I think, of a number of options that John Swinney laid out.
So pegged to sterling?
Not necessarily pegged to sterling, Brian. I would have thought being a part of the sterling area would be convenient on that sort of timescale.
What is the sterling area, Alan?
Well, part of sterling. I mean, yes. There are countries in Europe, let me explain this to you. There are countries in Europe, Luxembourg and Belgium, which shared the currency. That still meant they were independent countries. They went into the euro on the same day at the same rate.
And
we're facing,
they're pegged?
No, they're not pegged. They're part of the same currency area.
I'm afraid.
Two things
so are we to understand
that
as soon as you achieve your divorce of Scotland from the rest of Britain, the first thing you're going to do is go to the Bank of England and the English government and ask them if you might peg your currency to the English currency?
Some folk talking cliches, you talking posters. The word is independence. What I'm saying,
yes or no, Brian,
I think given, I'm about to answer your question, Brian, if you stop interrupting just for a second. I'm saying we're looking at a referendum on the euro. In 3 or 4 years' time, I think it would be to the convenience of Scotland and England if we went into the euro on the same day at the same rate. That seems to me the best of the options that John Swinney laid out.
Qualifying to going into the euro, do you not tonight want to say to the Scottish people what you say about the percentage of our...
What?
The percentage of the deficit? Do you not want to say anything about the deficit?
I say we meet all 5 qualification criteria. In the words of Andrew Hughes Hallett, we would sail through all 5 of these criteria.
Okay, Alex, just before we move on, I'd like to put to you the top viewers question that emerged with people emailing and phoning and so on. And people seem to be rather worried about the effects after independence of Scots in England and English people in Scotland. What would happen to them is what viewers want to know.
Well, we're talking about Scottish independence in the context of the European Union, in the context of a single market of 300 people with free travel and free rights of residence across that whole continent of Europe. So the straight answer to your question is nothing at all would happen to anyone. There would be no effect on travel and ability to see. You'd still be able to visit your granny in Newcastle and vice versa.
But would my granny in Newcastle be a Scottish citizen? I mean, would English in Scotland be a Scottish citizens? I understand they would. Would Scots in England also be citizens?
If your granny in Newcastle was born in Scotland, or if you're a granny living in Scotland, then they would automatically qualify for Scottish citizenship.
Yes. That's clear enough.
When living in Scotland, Mr. Salmond?
Sorry?
When living in Scotland?
Somebody who's normally resident in Scotland at the time of independence.
On the day of independence?
No, not on the day of independence. Somebody whose main residence is in Scotland, in the same way that someone who's overseas, when they have a child born at the present moment, Brian, that child is still a UK citizen.
Mr. Salmond, your party produced a document called Citizens Not Subjects in 1997. In that document, you said that your policy was that those who would be entitled to Scottish citizenship were persons born in Scotland or persons resident in Scotland on the date of independence. Is that not right?
Deal with that very quickly.
Well, it means
Alexander.
normally resident in Scotland. If you're overseas on a trip or a business trip or working, you're still a Scottish citizen, Brian. I mean that's I must say so. It's pointless beneath you.
Would Sean Connery be a Scottish citizen?
Yes, he would. He was born in Scotland.
If the opinion
he chose
polls,
to be so, it's not compulsory.
if the opinion polls are to be believed, then it looks as if the SNP may well be the second biggest party in the new Parliament. Brian Fitzpatrick?
Alec, one of your colleagues has described Scotland's Parliament as a kid-on Parliament, a Parliament that's bound to fail. In fact, she said it last night. Can we be clear about what she meant by that? For your party to win your dream, this Parliament's got to fail. You've got to make sure that it doesn't work.
No, I think we've got to make sure it works. I think the way to get Scotland to vote for an independent Parliament is to make a success of the devolved Parliament. And I see that very clearly, because if this Scottish Parliament can, for example, demonstrate that it's running the Scottish education system well, then surely the conclusion that people in Scotland will come to, Brian, is it could run the Scottish economy well. So I think we've got more investment in the success of this Parliament than any other party.
So can I invite you to distance yourself from remarks in relation to Scotland's Parliament being a kid-on Parliament or a plasticine Parliament?
The remarks I've laid out are the party's policy, and that's what. Well, Brian, I wouldn't talk to me about divisions in the party's policy. You've got majority of candidates who don't believe in the trident nuclear system.
Malcolm Bruce.
You do accept, Alex, that we live in a multi-party system in Scotland, and you are not the only party that speaks for the people of Scotland.
I accept that, yes.
And you've also said on occasions that you believe we are moving into new politics, which involves cross-party voting and cooperation.
Correct.
Can you say why it was, given your commitment that as you've just said, that you want to make the Scottish Parliament work, that you didn't, as a party, join the Scottish Constitutional Convention, which actually works to deliver the Parliament which is now about?
I think we can rake over ancient history, Malcolm, if you like.
It's not very ancient, actually. It's very relevant to what's happening next week.
But surely what is more relevant is the joint campaign that we had 2 years ago to deliver a yes vote for Scotland. Now, when we were in that campaign, Malcolm, I didn't hear you quarrel with the SNP's commitment to it. The SNP's commitment to that campaign was wholehearted. I would seem to remember a meeting in this very auditorium with the three parties represented and Mr. Sean Connery. And incidentally, Liberals were very keen to get photographs with him on that occasion.
If you could be very brief,
well,
we're almost out of time.
The point you're making is that you're willing to work with other parties when it suits, such as at the referendum time, but you weren't prepared to take practical decisions to determine how the Parliament was elected or what powers it would have. How can you really say that you do want to work with other people if you're not prepared to do that? Your track record isn't very good, is it?
Malcolm, I think the track record in the referendum campaign was a very good one, and I think the politics that were engendered in that period, I think a lot of people wished had been carried through to this election campaign. But you know, the decisions about the shape of the Scotland Act were actually made in the House of Commons, and there was a number of occasions where my colleagues and your colleagues combined together, and there was a number of occasions where the person sitting in your right's government voted down our proposals. So even within the context of new politics, you're going to get argument and debate, and the argument between devolution and independence is a legitimate argument and debate for us to have in Scottish politics in the current context and in Scottish politics in the new Parliament.
Alec, if you are committed, as you say, to this new Parliament, why not drop the referendum pledge, which may well destabilise a first administration by talking about constitutional change throughout, and prove it?
Well, the referendum pledge is part of our politics. All of the evidence that we have is that the majority of people in Scotland believe whatever their view on independence is the way to decide that question is through a referendum.
So how many referendums would you have? If you get no the first time, would you keep going and going and going?
No, we'd intend to win the first referendum, Annie. That would be our intention.
And if
you
lost
couldn't have another referendum unless you got a fresh mandate from the people to hold the referendum. They would have to go back and seek
But you will
another
continue to
mandate.
ask for one, is what you're
Well,
saying.
we intend to win the first referendum.
Briefly, Brian
You,
Monteith.
you don't really want to win this election, do you? Your leadership style is much better suited to opposition. Surely, in a sense, there's a strategy for you that says being in opposition for 4 years, coming in, arguing, chipping away, and saying in 4 years' time, well, in fact, it was a plasticine parliament, it didn't have enough powers, give us a mandate. Surely that is really your strategy.
Well, I noticed in the Scotsman poll of polls this morning that we had 3 times as much support as the Conservative Party. We must be trying to win
That's
it
not
3
relevant to
times
the
as much
question.
as you, Brian.
not relevant
I'll
to
give
the
you
question.
an exclusive tonight. The Scottish National Party are trying to win this election for Scotland.
You're not succeeding.
Just briefly in the last few minutes, we'd like to look at the personal aspects of this. Mr. Salmond is, of course, bidding to become First Minister. Malcolm Bruce, very briefly.
Well, during the course of the last few weeks, your popularity ratings have slumped somewhat, I think to about half what they started out just a few weeks ago. Why do you think that's happened? Why do you think the people of Scotland don't trust you as much now as they did a few weeks ago?
Well, the last poll actually showed my popularity rating increasing 10 points, but then, of course, I don't look at these things. But you might as well ask me...
You're hearing different things.
You might as well ask me why it's increased by 10 points over the last 2 weeks. I mean, the popularity or otherwise of the party leaders and the parties they represent will be judged by the Scottish people a week on Thursday.
It's undeniable,
not in
Alex,
opinion
and it's
polls.
undeniable, isn't it, that something went wrong over the past few weeks. Can you deny that?
Sorry, Annie, if you're going on opinion polls, as I say, there was a 10% jump over the last 2 weeks. Now, I think we'll judge this matter a week on Thursday in front of the people of Scotland, not in opinion polls.
There are a lot of grumblings being reported about in your party. Fundamentalists are seemingly just waiting to pounce. Are you still going to be the leader after this election?
Yes or no?
I hope to be leader and First Minister of Scotland.
Very briefly, Brian Monteith.
Alec, in judging this matter next week, as you say, the Scottish people will take into account that you've been guilty of at least 2 serious misjudgments in this campaign. Firstly, your Kosovo statement came out of the blue. Not my words, Mrs MacDonald's words. Secondly, that tax wasn't handled too well, to say the least. Again, Margot's words, not my words. The Scottish people want a future they can trust. If you tonight won't say whether there's a deficit or surplus in Scotland, why should they gamble their future on you rather than trust the future they can trust with Donald Dewar?
I wondered if you were going to get to the question, Brian. I think the answer to your question is the judgment that will matter is not your judgment, not Donald Dewar's judgment, not Alex Salmond's judgment, but the judgment of the people of Scotland, and I'm very happy that they're the jury in this matter.
Last question, Alex. Assuming, of course it would never happen, but assuming that things don't go all that well on May the 7th, you carry the can personally within the party, don't you? I mean, how do you recover from this first Scottish election if it doesn't go well?
Well, Annie, I'm trying to win this election, and I'm very confident that the Scottish people will listen to the case we have, and I think I'm going to be delighted with the support we get at the ballot box.
Was that a straight answer?
It's a very confident answer, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Okay, Alex Salmond, thank you for that. And that's all we have time for tonight. Tomorrow, in our final programme, we cross-examine Donald Dewar. And if you'd like to put a question to him, you can ring us on 0800 099 099. You can fax us on 0141 338 2118. And there's also an email address on our website. That's www.bbc.co.uk/Scotland99. Until tomorrow at 10:45 from all of us here in Edinburgh, good night.
You can quiz Alex. Spotlighted the high road to independence.